We will get started. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the entire team at the Atlantic Economic Council, we are so thrilled that you'll be spending the next hour with us. And welcome to what's going to be an amazing session about diversity at work. My name is Erin Ishuk. I recently joined the council as Manager of Marketing and Communications. And I'm just thrilled to have this role and to be involved. We want to say a quick thank you to so many people who support us. The work of the council simply can't happen without the support of our patron members, many of who might be on this call today. So thank you for that. And a special thank you to ACOA, who contributed to our two most recent reports on diversity that you'll hear a little bit about shortly. And with that point, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge we've released a lot of research this year showing the economic contribution of Indigenous businesses and communities. And we are currently working on a new project around economic reconciliation, which is so critical to this region. And with that, we would like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we all are today, we are participating on the lands which are the traditional and unceded territory of various First Nations. Now, I would like to turn it over to my colleagues for a brief discussion, an overview of some of the research we've done and some of the key highlights here today. And we'll be sharing some links in the chat that you can go and read those reports. Also, at any point, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will respond to them as soon as we can. With that, I'll turn it over to our President and CEO, David Chundy, who is the CEO of the Atlantic Economic Council and will be the moderator for our panel discussion. First, he will be asking a few questions of Fred Bergman, our Senior Policy Analyst, who is also the lead researcher on both diversity and inclusion and on the Indigenous firms and communities. Over to you, David and Fred.
Well, thank you, Erin, and great to have you join us at the Council. And welcome to everyone who's joining us today for this webinar, whether you're watching this live this morning or watching the recording afterwards. The Council's interest in this topic comes directly out of our mission. We do want to see a healthy and prosperous Atlantic Canada economy, but we also want everyone to have a chance to be able to contribute to that and benefit from that prosperity. In addition to changing social dynamics and values, our aging workforce and the resulting shortage of workers have pushed employers to seek to engage groups of individuals who may not have fully participated in the workforce in the past. They've also sought to retain their older workers and attract employees from other countries. As immigration has increased, this is contributing to a more visibly diverse population in our cities in particular. And Erin, if you just want to advance to the next slide. So Fred has been leading our research on this topic. And Fred, this slide gives a current snapshot from the most recent census of various diverse groups in our population and what those shares are. But how quickly is Atlantic Canada's population changing in terms of some of these visible measures of diversity?
Well, David, Canada's historical immigration policies have fueled significant population growth, and this has resulted in rising diversification across the region. Atlantic Canada is also experiencing increasing diversity, most notably in terms of visible minorities in particular. And if you could advance a slide, that would be great, Erin. In 1996, visible minorities comprised about 2% of the region's population. 20 years later, this share rose to 4% in 2016. And by 2021, visible minorities reached about 7% of the region's population, and that percentage has likely increased since then. However, there's still much lower than the 26% share that we're seeing nationally for visible minorities. PEI stands out in the region with particular rapid growth in visible minorities as a share of total population in that province. Our Looking Ahead series highlighted our aging population. I think it was bulletin number 5, which will result in labor shortages. For every 10 people retiring in Atlantic Canada today, there are only 7 young people entering the labor force. This is driving the need to retain older workers as long as possible to recruit more immigrants. Our projections showed that this will continue to push diversity higher over the next 20 years.
So, Fred, we released our kind of initial report on diversity and inclusion 2 years ago, and we updated that earlier this year with the census data from 2021, and we have that report released earlier this year that we'll be posting in the chat, and we can plan to continue tracking our progress as we go forward every 5 years. Women, as we see here, account for about half of our population, but when it comes to the labor market, how well are they doing?
Well, David, women account for close to one half of the population and total employment in the region. However, women are underrepresented in both management and senior management positions. About 39% of senior management jobs are held by women in 2021 in Atlantic Canada, up from about 34% in 2016, 5 years earlier. We are seeing continued progress, however, in terms of women in management positions, but there's still work to do to match their population and employment shares in the region. However, this region is doing quite well, with higher shares of women in management than what we're seeing nationally in Canada. The share of women on boards and companies in Atlantic Canada has also improved from about 21% in 2017 to about 25% in 2020.
That's great. Thank you, Fred. So when we look at other dimensions beside gender, are we seeing progress there as well?
Well, generally, yes. Since 1996, we saw rising shares of employment in managerial positions for immigrants, visible minorities, and Black Atlantic Canadians. Visible minorities, as noted on an earlier slide, account for about 7% of the region's population and about 8% of employment in Atlantic Canada. These shares are both up from roughly 2% way back in 1996. We are making progress in this region, but visible minorities remain below their benchmark population shares in terms of managers or senior manager positions. Immigrants are the exception, however, with a higher share in management than their benchmark population share.
So, Fred, as we're kind of showing on this slide, we're showing a lot of data at the regional level, but we certainly have data at the provincial level in the report that we released. So definitely some progress in terms of diversity and inclusion here, but still obviously a lot of work to do. But when it comes to earnings, how well are some of these diversity groups faring?
Well, David, relative median incomes have improved over the last 5 years for all the diversity groups that we looked at in our report. Women's earnings rose from about 68% of men's incomes in 2016 to about 77% of men's incomes in 2021. So there's still a 23% gap in terms of incomes being lower than men's incomes. Visible minorities have the lowest share of all worker median incomes in the region at about 83%, while immigrants are almost at the all-worker benchmark average. Incomes for women, immigrants, and Indigenous workers in Atlantic Canada are above the national median income for those particular diversity groups. So we're performing a little better in that respect than Canada as a whole.
Great, thank you, Fred. And I know there's lots of other numbers and metrics in our report that we're not going to go through today, but in our early report in 2022, we did discuss some of the benefits, kind of the economic and business benefits of diversity inclusion. So aside from tapping into a larger labor pool, why should employers pay attention to this issue?
Well, David, many organizations are now placing more emphasis on both diversity and inclusion in leadership, especially because it helps increase profitability and productivity. In addition, it promotes competitiveness and exports. It also drives innovation and contributes to economic growth, while helping to attain higher levels of both employee engagement with their employers and between the employees, obviously, as well as customer loyalty.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Fred. So just before we kind of finish with you and kind of the data discussion, we have also released another report, releasing that today, that looks at kind of diversity in terms of business ownership. Just for our audience, are there any key takeaways from that report that would be good for them to know about?
Well, David, there's 3 or more key takeaways in the report, but I'm just going to touch on some of the top 3. First, diversity in business ownership is much lower than what we see for labor market participation, as well as versus population shares. The one exception, however, is immigrant-owned businesses. They represent 9% of all firms in the region, which is higher than their benchmark population share, which I think on an earlier slide was around 6%. Second, despite these generally low shares, the ownership of Atlantic Canadian businesses is becoming more diverse. Large gains have been made over the last 2 decades for most diversity groups. So we looked at the data back to about 2005. For example, the number of women-owned businesses in the Atlantic region grew by about 30% between 2005 and 2020, and now accounts for about 20% of all the companies in the region as of 2020. We discussed these trends and the reasons behind them in our latest report that we released today on business ownership diversity. Third, businesses owned by diversity groups can make a large contribution to the region's economies, as our reports on Indigenous businesses have shown. For example, the report on significant economic contribution of Indigenous businesses and communities that we released back in July of this year.
Well, that's great, Fred. Thank you so much for leading our research on that, on these studies, and also for sharing some of the highlights with us today. So we now want to shift from the data and the what to the how and the why. And so I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists who are joining us today to talk about this. We have Dustin Bowers, the founder and CEO of PlayX Building Systems. We have April Howe, the founder of Crayon Strategies, and Dr. Dominique Roche, the senior consultant with Royer Thomson. So welcome to all 3 of you. Glad you can join us today, and you can turn on your videos now. That's great. So we can just maybe get each of you just to maybe introduce your organization and kind of why you've decided to kind of focus on, or why you do have a focus on employee diversity. And maybe Dustin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Dustin Bowers. I'm the founder of PlayX Building Systems. My background's in construction. Construction is definitely one of the areas where there is probably less diversity in general. There are a lot of compounding issues around that, but it's something that I've always sought to kind of create a bit more diversity in there and bring a more well-rounded team too. But we've developed a full plug-and-play building system, the world's first truly reusable building system, taking waste and turning it into a solution for the housing crisis. So happy to be on this panel, and thank you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So Dominique, can you tell us briefly a bit about Royer Thomson? I know many of you might have heard about it, but kind of in your particular role on this topic.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dominique Roche. I am a senior consultant with Royer Thomson. We do executive search, but also talent advisory and diversity and inclusion mandates with many organizations in Atlantic Canada. So very excited to participate in this panel.
Great. And then finally, April, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your interest in this topic, and maybe before we get lots of questions, you might want to explain the wall behind you as well.
Thank you so much, David. Good morning, everybody. So happy to be here. Thank you for having this dialogue and this conversation, first of all. I am founder and CEO of Crayon Strategies. And Crayon Strategies, we really get our hands in all things culture for organizations. So we work with organizations to help them figure out and map out their journey in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility. We help organizations that are looking to figure out how do we make our workplaces healthier, the workplace environment healthy, psychologically healthy, and create the culture that the organization wants. As far as the wall, for me, it's twofold. One, it's kind of representative of the idea that, they're all sneakers, right? Every one of them are sneakers, but they're all very different, right? So it's a diversity of something, but the core of it is the same. And that's kind of representative of my thoughts on diversity. And the second part is, where do you put all the sneakers? I needed somewhere to put them. So this is what I came up with, and it kind of serves both of those purposes in my mind. So thank you for asking, David.
No, that's great. And so then let's kind of start to talk about kind of the how, and maybe Dominique, what we'll start with you. Like, what are some steps that a company can take as you're working with clients? What are some of the steps that a company can take to create a more diverse and inclusive workplace?
Yeah. Royal Thompson, we have integrated and embedded diversity and inclusion at every stage of our executive search process to ensure clients and candidates feel cared for, valued, and respected. So that's what we have done internally. We provide unconscious bias training to search committees or interview panels. We also advise on the composition of such panels to be diverse. We have a diversified job advertisement strategy, use inclusive language in all recruitment materials, do targeted recruitment, have accessibility resources, and design an objective assessment matrix tailored to each search, just to name a few steps of our D&I approach. However, we have also worked with organizations that have implemented formal diversity and inclusion policies. They have revamped their onboarding processes to be culturally responsive. They have developed diversity and inclusion roadmaps and action plans, and done training on mitigating unconscious bias, learning about inclusive leadership, and how to foster inclusive climates. And we also focus on identifying the correlation and intersection between diversity and inclusion and psychological safety, compliance, and employee well-being.
That's great. I know you mentioned a couple of terms there, but I know unconscious bias may be fairly self-explanatory, but can you just maybe give a layman's like, what does this mean, or how would we recognize if it's unconscious that we might be having it? Can you just maybe just quickly clarify for our attendees?
Yeah, of course. So unconscious bias are shortcuts in our brains that they're neural connections formed by something in our brains that is called synapses. So they form from predetermined knowledge of what we have learned during our childhood and from sources of information like schools, like parents, but also from cues on our environment. So as we grow, this knowledge kind of sinks in our brains and makes us have assumptions about certain individuals or situations.
And
Oh, that's great.
if I could jump on top of that, I love the way that you frame that, Dominique. What I'll add is that the important part to recognize is that it's not something you recognize, right?
Yeah.
So you don't often know that you're having it. It's usually a very sort of a response to something that you don't control. And what I say to people often is, your first thought is not your fault. Your second thought is the one you're responsible for.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Then after that, your behavior after that, you're really responsible for. But your first thought is that innate sort of reactionary, but your second thought is the one you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, it happens below our level of conscious awareness.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Good.
April's very, very practical. So April, can I just jump in and get you, like, you work with a lot of clients on this, and then we'll turn to Dustin. Like, what are some of the key steps you advise companies to take or your clients to take? Like, what are some of the first things they should be doing as they're kind of moving into, creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions. I think, organizations, diving into this space shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction to the market. You have to ask yourself the why. What's your why? Why does it matter? Because that will end up being reflected in what you do. So ask yourself as an organization, as a leadership team, what is your why for wanting to be more diverse, wanting to be more inclusive, and creating a space of belonging? And then the second thing to ask yourself is, do I know enough to lead this charge? So do you feel you have the cultural competence? Do you feel that, that is within your organization to lead the charge? And if you don't feel comfortable with your own level of competence around EDIB, then that's when you look for someone outside of your organization to help lead that charge. So education is absolutely critical. The thing that you don't want to do is diversify without having created the conditions for people who are of different equity seeking groups to come into your organization, and then it's not a place where they feel safe. It's not a place where they feel welcomed. And so diversifying is only half of what you need to do. You need to create the conditions and the space. So you have to do both. And so you really want to think about that and how you would approach that. And that's the work that we do to help organizations figure that out.
That's great, April, very clear. So Dustin, you run your own company. I know this is a topic that's important to you, and I know you might have wanted to add a comment earlier. So, what are some of the steps that you've done in your own company? And feel free to respond to what Dominique or April's already kind of shared.
Yeah, so I would say on the Dominique's thing with the unconscious bias, I think a way that maybe business owners would understand it in more business terms is an exposure bias. So if you're only looking at a certain set of data and then you're presented another set of data, you're going to have a bias towards the set of data that was presented in a more favorable light. And I think a lot of the issues that arise in job sites around diversity are really an exposure bias issue, and that is where those unconscious biases come out of. And creating positive opportunities for positive exposure can start to shift that exposure bias. People don't like to hear they're wrong, and confrontation never really solves this problem of diversity. The people I've in the construction industry, I've worked with people across the spectrum. I've always had a very diverse crew whenever I'm hiring for job sites, but there's also been a lot of people who are frankly flat out racist. And I've also been able to see some changes in those people by not being combative with it, but creating opportunities to challenge that exposure bias. And I think this is where, what April said about the why is really important, because if you don't understand or identify the why you want to have a diverse team or why it's important to have a diverse team, and it's just a metric and you want to just be able to be like, hey, look, we're diverse, it's going to actually have the negative impact. And I mean, there's a lot of recent research that came out, and it's, instead of reducing bias, they engender hostile attribution bias. And this amplifies perceptions of prejudicial hostility where none was present. And so sometimes people are looking for problems, and if we're not careful about how we implement this, it actually has the opposite effect of creating hostility within the workforce. And our approach to it has been doing blind testing with new candidates. Can we find ways to, if we're hiring a candidate, we find the best people from their applications on an objective metric basis on merit. And then we give each of those top candidates a test. Our HR separates the names or any identifying factors from those tests. Those go to the department, whether it's design or whether it's administrative or whatever. That test goes to the head of that department. They rate them on a series of merit-based metrics. And then we're able to make a decision without any of the other biases involved. And I think there's little steps like that that can help to improve it. And it's, from a business perspective, I understand where there's a lot of pushback on DEI, because I think maybe sometimes things went to the other way where people were using it as a badge of honor instead of looking at it from a real way of how can we build a collaborative society where people are actually working in the same direction. And so if you find that why, then you realize like, hey, if I have a diverse team, I can do international business easier. If I have a diverse team, I can deal with language barriers easier. If I have a diverse team, I can bring in solutions that people have developed in other parts of the world. Those are strong economic incentives to have a diverse team, but you have to be careful about the implementation of that so that it's not creating more negative bias within that process.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
And just in terms of your why and the benefits, like what was your why and how's that kind of translated into like this is not just good for me and the people I've employed, but this has been good for us as a team and the clients we serve. Can you just maybe share a little briefly?
Yeah, us as a startup, we're looking for high ambition people who are go-getters, who are going to go that extra mile. And you know what? Nothing says I'm a dedicated, hardworking individual like tearing up your life and going to another country for a better life. I mean, so, we've found some of the most ambitious, hardworking, dedicated client employees out of the immigrant pool that's come here. I mean, there is a bit of I think maybe social media is a bit to blame, but there is a bit of a rock going on in our society right now as far as, work ethic and such. And I do find that there is often still a higher work ethic amongst new immigrants than some of the younger kids here. As he said, for every 10 leaving the job force, there's only 7 entering. And, I think there's work to do there as well. We need to create opportunities to include our own youth again back into the workforce and inspire them. But I think creating those more welcoming and diverse employment opportunities helps to bridge that gap a bit. But for us, it's been about finding people. It's merit based. We look at merit. We don't look at color. In our business, we actually we agree with the Canadian Charter, and nobody should be discriminated against, no matter your color, gender, your sexual orientation, whatever. Like, that's your business. Can you meet the requirements of the job, and can you work hard? And that's, I think, where companies need to look at and work through things. Some people definitely need to work through the preconceptions and biases they've built up over a lifetime, and it's not a snap your fingers process.
I know, that's great. So I'd like to, I think you've all made some very helpful kind of practical kind of comments. Are there any tools, obviously they can work with a consultant and if they need that kind of specialized help, but are there any resources or tools or kind of practical training that have been helpful in your organization or as you've worked with clients? Look, these have been particularly helpful in helping clients take steps in this direction. And I'll just open that up for whoever wants to jump in. I see Dominic, you nodding, so maybe you want to jump in first.
Sure, perfect. Thank you. Such an important question. It's important to understand the why, but also important to understand how. So we only use research instruments that aim to uncover the current state or the level of readiness of organizations. So some of my favorites as a senior consultant is the implicit association test from Harvard University, and that one is used for inclusion for unconscious bias, global diversity and inclusion benchmarks, the Gartner Inclusion Index. There are also a lot of gender decoders. That's just to name a few. But we often advise organizations incorporate demographic data in their assessments and metrics. I want to emphasize the importance of a sort of mixed method approach for internal feedback and surveys. So organizations usually rely on quantitative information like surveys, but they often miss the richness and depth of qualitative data can offer. So it is also important to look closely at segregated data. So that is the information that has been broken down into subgroups or subcategories, since that information can unveil important details that might be missed in aggregated data sets, whereby information is combined and presented as a larger idea or conclusion. So one example, when we refer to women in leadership positions, women from equity-deserving groups, and particularly brown and Black women, are 4 times less likely to be promoted to CEO positions when compared to their counterparts. So those are the kinds of stories that we might be missing. I will also want to add that when it comes to hiring new Canadians, we're extremely lucky in Atlantic Canada to have leading settlement services organizations like iSense, which recently celebrated its 45-year anniversary. And we offer several services to employers, recruit and retain newcomers, and often free of charge.
That's great. April, anything that you wanted to add in terms of particular tools or resources that you find helpful when you're working with clients?
Yeah, so Dominic stole my thunder on a few pieces there. Dominic, that was very thorough. I would add perhaps so just to double down on ISANS as a resource. So the Immigrant Settlement Association of Nova Scotia, they offer really well done, highly informed workshops to help employers that are looking to diversify and sort of understanding some of the cultural, I'll say nuances for lack of a better term. But they have lots of really great resources. So I double down on that. I'd also, the Canadian CCDI, so the Canadian Council for Diversity and Inclusion is another really good resource. They've got a lot of research and a lot of tools that you can utilize. And I imagine that some of the folks that are on this call, their organizations are members of CCDI. The other thing that maybe we hadn't thought of, and I know in this era of AI, if you're looking to perhaps ensure that some sort of communication that's public facing is one that is, using inclusive language, for instance, you can put something like that through ChatGPT or any AI software and ask it to review it for inclusive language. So that is a quick and easy, solution if you're unsure. And I found them to be fairly comprehensive and catch most. I've tried it and I still like my own human eye against these things, but at least that's a good place to start. And the other tools that aren't necessarily free, but important to do, is really understanding the demographic of the community in which you're in, or that you are looking to recruit from. So if Canada is the community, then understanding the demographics, I think, is really important. It's not hard to get that information through Census Canada. And also, lastly, I really think it's important for organizations to understand what they have currently represented in terms of their diversity. So, doing demographic surveys is something my firm does daily, to help organizations understand how people identify in terms of their sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, ability, so on and so forth. So you've got to start from somewhere. It's tough to diversify if you don't know necessarily where you're starting from. So we do these quite often, and I think whatever source you use, that it's important to at least start to get a handle on, what diversity you currently have.
Oh, that's great. And April, that's partly why we wanted to start doing our reports. Like, here's the benchmark for the population by province, and certainly you can drill down by industry or different communities. But that is partly what we wanted to do, not just track progress, but look, here's the benchmark, and that's why we've tended to use population as kind of the overall benchmark, kind of doing those
Absolutely.
assessments. And so I know both of you have mentioned kind of the ISANS, the Immigrant Settlement Association of Nova Scotia, but I know there are similar organizations, immigrant settlement associations and multicultural associations in the other Atlantic provinces, and that I'm sure you can easily find those if you're not aware of those and not already connected to those. And I know they would have some very similar programs. And Dominique, I know you'd mentioned a couple of instruments you use. If you have easy links to those, you wanted to post them in the chat for people, feel free to do that, but I'll just leave that to you if you have those handy or not. Dustin, anything else that you found particularly helpful as a tool or resource? I know you kind of mentioned the blind testing around recruitment, but anything else that you found helpful as a small startup in this space that's been helpful for you that you wanted to share at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for us, it's been something where I think if you're doing things right, it will happen naturally. And I do understand that different businesses are in different situations. But, even in my years as in the construction industry, I always had a team with like, I had some LGBT working with me. I had, many different colors and cultures working and always had a diverse team. I mean, I grew up Southern Ontario initially before I moved out here, and I mean, it's very multicultural, very diverse. And I've lived in Vancouver for a while, and I was literally the only white guy on the crew, and so I've worked a lot in that, and I think what I've seen, and there's a lot of research that's come out lately, is we need to be careful about implementing it. I think there are some industries like construction where you're gonna always have an imbalance. You're not gonna have an even number of men and women working on the team. You're not gonna have an even number of immigrants working on the team necessarily. I mean, it depends on what things specifically. I mean, some industries are overrepresented even, but that comes down to skill levels as well. And so I think people do need to approach it from the right place to be able to achieve these things. And that's where I say I think it's more about results based than target based. Like, what are your KPIs? And I think identifying the correct KPIs with this is very, very important because, there are, and I'd love to hear from April and Dominic on this, but I mean, there are industries that it is undeniable. In healthcare, you have a higher rate of women workers. In the construction trades, you have a higher rate of men workers. And I don't think that's going to change. I mean, we look at countries like Sweden that have very high standards for that, and it's even more pronounced, And I think part of our culture too is like almost put too much pressure on some women. I know several of my female friends who feel bad about wanting to be a mom now, and we need that. If we're going to raise the next generation, we do need that. And that is an honorable thing as well. So I think there's a balance there. I think some industries are always going to be a bit imbalanced just because of the nature of the work. But I'd love to hear April and Dominic's thoughts on that as well, because I think it's something we got to be careful not to get lost in targets and really focus on the results and what they mean for our communities.
No, that's great. Just
Well,
before April
sorry,
or
go
Dominic
ahead.
jumps in, I just want to give a shout out for anyone who wants to put in a question in the chat. If you've got a question you'd like to ask for the panelists, this would now be the time to pose your question in the chat, and we will try to address as many of those questions as we can. So I just wanted to give people time. But April, I know you wanted to respond to Dustin on that question.
Yeah, I think, there's an interesting perspective here. I love what you said, Dustin, which is contrary because when we were prepping for this, Dustin and I didn't always agree on everything. And I wouldn't even say that we disagree. We had both had philosophies that I think both were very just and very relevant and true, just shift in perspective. So I think that organizations, and I agree with you on this, Dustin, that sometimes we feel like we need to get to this certain place. So we don't have enough African Nova Scotians, or we don't have enough immigrants, or we're not diverse enough in terms of, sexual orientation and representation. And I think first, what's most important to think about is it's most important that you create conditions that give people the opportunity to be there if they want to be there. And I loved your point, Dustin, about some women that really are just wired, not just, but are wired to be moms and really want to play that important role in our society, because that's a really important role too. But feel a certain amount of guilt because we haven't valued that role the way we valued a woman in leadership in an organization. So I agree with you. We need to be very careful. To me, what this whole dialogue is about is opportunity first, so that people can be and feel that they have the opportunity to be where they want to be. So if I want to aspire to being a senior management in one of our large organizations here, I want to feel like I can get there based on my ability. And so I think that narrative is very, very important. And then secondly, I agree with you also, Dustin, that it's not about necessarily hitting a target, and we're kind of moving away from goals and targets around DEI and representation and moving towards just measured progress. Like, can we just really understand that last year, we hired 3 new immigrants, and this year we're looking to onboard 6. So I don't know what the target is, but I know that that's progress. And so really thinking about progress and relieving yourself a little bit of creating targets. I think if everybody's moving in the right direction, we will get to wherever it is that we're trying to get to. But I think that's the progress is more important than goals in my mind.
That's great. So I know we've got some questions. I just want to maybe ask one last question to the panelists, and then we'll take some of the audience questions. As organizations change, there's certainly many dimensions of diversity, some are more visible than others. And I know, April, you started off, look, we work a lot around culture. So how do you ensure employees feel included throughout an organization? And how do organizations ensure that they hear and benefit from those different perspectives or insights or experiences? How do we ensure it's inclusive, that we benefit from that diversity and people feel I'm a part of this, and I can put my hand up and I feel included. So any kind of specific thoughts or ideas from that point of view? April?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I thought you were talking to Dominique.
I was starting with you first, but anyway, go ahead.
Sorry, repeat the question for me. I thought you were talking
just in terms of, like, you've talked a lot about culture, but in terms of how do organizations ensure that everyone feels included, whatever their background, whatever their diversity group they might affiliate with, and how do organizations ensure that they're hearing and benefiting from different perspectives and different experiences, lived experiences or otherwise, or different skills? And like, when you bring people from different countries, there's lots of great ideas that other people have done. So how do we ensure that employers hear those and are able to utilize within their business, and everyone feels like I have an equal part with the people that have been here for decades and have been part of maybe the majority?
Absolutely. I apologize I was reading the chat. That's why
That's all right. Sorry.
I didn't hear you. I got caught. I think that there is, you just have to ask people. It's as simple as that. You have to ask. And the fear in asking, I think, is what prevents us from really understanding what matters, and not just to those who are have had historical discrimination. When I talk about diversity, I'm not talking about everybody who isn't white, first of all. That is not what diversity is. Diversity is the full and entire mix of everyone. So if you are the white male heterosexual, yes, you are included in the dialogue. It is not, this is not something that we're only talking about a specific subset or every other subset. So I think that's an important message to get across. And I often talk about the idea that, white men are not the enemy. As a matter of fact, I feel, and my theory is, it is more important that people of the majority, whatever culture you're talking about, and in this culture, in this context, we're talking about North America, whoever is the majority should play the biggest role in creating the shift. And so I very inclusively believe that men that look like you, David, have to be part of this conversation. And it's another reason why I appreciate, you leading and being at the forefront of these conversations and being engaged. So I think that that's important. I think that we also need to consider how we engage people and talk to them about what they're experiencing. So you can't fix something if you don't even understand what the challenge is and what people's experience is. So most of us have the capacity to do an internal survey, for instance. I always suggest you do an external, so have somebody external doing it to protect around confidentiality. However, the first thing to do is to ask people. And our fear of that conversation, which many, many people have, should not be the thing that prevents you from understanding people's experience. So we sort of have to push past the fear of maybe saying the wrong thing or being perceived the wrong way. And you may not get a lot of response the first time, right? But when you come back again and ask that question in 6 months or a year, then really it's really important for you to continue to push for that. So trying to understand and to illustrate that you're trying to understand, for me, is a critically important part of it, because you cannot assume what people are experiencing. You have to ask. So I think that that's really key.
Dustin, in terms of your company, like how do you ensure you're benefiting from that diversity and everyone feels a part of your organization? Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I guess, my years in construction definitely gave me a lot of experience in being able to manage crews and stuff. But I will say, even shifting into the new industry, I am a bit of a larger than life character. I can be very, my voice carries. I'm intense. I'm moving quick. I'm often just firing off ideas and bouncing between, the human ping pong ball effect of being a founder and, you know, it's intense, and I've had to learn a bit to moderate myself. And actually, one of the big things has been to make sure that I've taken time with the employees, and this is across the board. It's not just with our immigrant employees or others. I mean, some of them, the language barriers can be a real issue. There are ways to bridge that for certain roles, but what I've found is really important is just letting people know on a one-on-one basis, like, hey, if you're uncomfortable, if you feel brushed over, if you feel something, speak up. And I think there's only so much you can do to actually push people to speak up. I mean, there is, business needs to move forward. And I think, seeing in the comment section, this is why a lot of companies have moved away from DEI specifically, is because there's a balance there between effectiveness and efficiency. But I think as a founder, I've been able to realize and recognize, like, okay, I need to take time, shut up, listen, let them know that they can bring anything to me. They're never going to be made to feel bad because they brought up an issue. And I think that's really important for people to be able to feel included and heard. And that goes for any employee, really. I mean, that's a foundational relationship thing. You need to make sure people feel safe to bring up a problem if there is one. And, that's something I think we're all walking and learning in.
That's great. So we do have some questions coming in, and I think the one that's coming in different places is just around, some recent announcements and companies deciding to kind of walk back at least part of their policies around diversity and inclusion, and concerns around where this is going. How do we navigate that in Canada? And so, any advice for companies kind of navigating, okay, we're trying to make progress in here, we're seeing other people step back, and I'm a little confused, like, should I be going forward? Like, what advice would you give to employers just navigating, a changing discourse on this topic? And I know, Dustin, you kind of referenced that. So, but anyone wants to jump in on that, how do we navigate this environment that's kind of just seems to be getting a little more complicated for people who maybe not well educated or informed and just trying to make sense of the signals they're seeing?
I think that, you need to understand the reality of your community, first of all. And sometimes those situations happen when you don't have the proper governance framework. And this is crucial for, diversity and inclusion. So this involves creating, implementing, and frequently revising policies and practices to ensure the sustainability of D&I within organizations. So that compliance piece should be informed not only by local or federal policy, which, is often the case, but we must look also beyond and follow international standards and best practices. So those are the consequences of not doing things right from the beginning. But also, we cannot compare ourselves to others. We need to be mindful of our audience, our client base, our demographics, and just work with that.
Mm-hmm.
So a question, I think, kind of two related questions, on this topic. One is like, what's the biggest opportunity for employers and what's the biggest challenge? And another question had the same thing, like what are the key systematic barriers or challenges to equitable hiring and promotion? So what are the opportunities here that people should be thinking about? And, what's the biggest barrier that maybe we need to start to address as a employer, as a society? Anyone want to jump in on opportunities or kind of challenges?
I'll jump in maybe on, hiring, so attraction, recruitment, and retention. Formerly, I was responsible for hiring a recruitment process for the province of Nova Scotia. And it was a very, very good um, opportunity to understand what gets in our way sometimes when we think about equitable hiring. And these are all human problems we have. Okay, there's nothing technical. There's nothing system, like these are all human issues, and so you need human solutions assisted by technology at times. And so, some of the challenges are just the things that we value, and the safety we often feel that we need to create within our organizations. When we talk about fit, which is in the world of recruiting and from a DEI perspective, is the next bad F word. We really want to move away from fit and move to cultural contribution. And so, how is somebody contributing to our culture? Because fitting is, more of the same. And so, really trying to figure out, where can we benefit from, someone that thinks, sees, looks, and perceives differently than we do. So opening yourself up to that, I think fear is one of the things that that really gets in the way. So as I said earlier, fear of having the conversation, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of inviting people into the space that are just so different than the rest of the people in the space is usually a huge part of why organizations often struggle. I think that people feel like they're stepping into space that they don't really know what's going to become of it, when in the reality is you absolutely have, I won't say control, but you can really have design and be the architect of the environment that you want. I'm saying hello to Rima because we work together at the province. So it's very, very important for folks to really think about what's holding them back, right? If you're saying other priorities, then where do people fit in your overall priorities? Because it's about people, right? It's about humans. If it's, money, if it's funding, then ask yourself what are the resources that can help us that are low cost or no cost. Dominic and I have mentioned various resources that are low or no cost. So there is absolutely a way for us to figure out how to at least start the conversation. And then looking at people like myself, like the work that Dominic does at Royer. There are organizations like ours that can help you on the pathway. So looking for that external support, I think, is also another option.
Great. Dominic, maybe I'll ask this question on aging to you. There's always a lot of concerns around youth unemployment. I've seen a lot of employers looking to retain older workers. It's another dimension of diversity. But sometimes maybe if you're an older person, you're getting perceived to be near retirement, you could face discrimination as well because, look, we don't think they're going to be here long enough. So how do you have any advice or deal with kind of that age dimension in terms of employers looking to ensure a diverse workforce?
Yeah. So I will say it depends also in which industry we're talking about, right? So let's say when it comes to generating power, or the construction industry or the healthcare industry, you need people to keep. You need like all kinds of people to keep the wheels moving, and it's not an option really. It's something that you have to do. Like in healthcare, I was reading that is almost 40% of the workforce that is now diverse. With that, we will have issues. That was not the case. So when it comes to maybe ageism or bias against age. We need to also understand the benefits of having people that have been around for a long time, their institutional knowledge, what they know about the community, their years of experience in the business, in the industry. And maybe the opportunity there is for organizations to leverage all that knowledge, all that experience, and do mentorship programs, for example. So pairing like your younger workers with your more seasoned workers, and the results are often great when you do that.
That's great. So there's two questions. We're getting close to time. I just like to quickly try to cover two questions I think are important. One is that a very practical question. How do you deal with coworkers who just not acknowledge your presence, especially if you're a person of color? Any advice? Like, how do you address that in the workforce? Anyone want to quickly just jump in with a quick answer on that?
Dustin?
Well, I think it's important. This is where I think that the why that April had mentioned is important, is that so that you're not just hiring somebody to fill some sort of DEI role. I think avoids those situations in the first place, because then you're bringing somebody based on merit who's contributing. And I love that idea of contribution to the culture. I'm definitely a contributionist as another ideal of doing things. I think that's how we succeed as a species is by everybody contributing what they can to make the world just a little better than they found it. And I think kindness, realize that a lot of people's issues are probably an exposure bias or unconscious bias. And I think trying to appeal to people's humanity is important. And if there's not a good fit, just move on. If the company you're working for, you don't feel valued, go find another job. Like maybe that sounds a little bit harsh, but we do have a diverse economy. There are lots of opportunities. I think people often box themselves in with, this is the only option for me. And that is a toxic place to be mentally. I think, it is, people do the same thing in relationships. This is the only one. And then they stay in some abusive relationship. And it's really, get out of that. It's a big world. We live in a big world. And for me as an employer, if I have an employee who I'll reprimand, I'll give them a warning if they're exhibiting some sort of negative behavior to a coworker. If they continue that, I'm quick to fire. I think employers have a responsibility to create a cohesive work environment for their employees. And I think employees have a responsibility to not put up with shit. Pardon my language, but that's the truth. And I think have compassion. That's the biggest thing, is like a lot of people are lacking that ability to realize, the idea of walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, and this is, for me, I think my controversial side of this is like, I think the E in DEI is the thing that causes a lot of issues, because we are diverse. Part of diversity means that there is not equity. We're equal before the law, but equity means everybody's getting the same results. And we're never going to achieve a place where everybody's getting the same results. And personally, I fear that ideal. I think it's not healthy. I think it holds back innovation. And I think that's why a lot of companies are moving away from DEI, because of that equity part of it, where there needs to be equality. We need to treat each other equal. But, I don't have the same skills in coding and design as my mechatronics engineer. I don't care what color he is. He's a great worker. He's a great guy. I enjoy hanging out with him. We have very different religious beliefs. We have very different cultural beliefs. We can still hang out. We can still share laughs. We can still work together towards the same goal. And that's where I think the why is so important, is like hire on merit and remove those exposure biases wherever you can. And you're going to have a more diverse team naturally in that process.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. So we are almost right at time. We have put an evaluation form in the chat before you sign off from the webinar. If you're able to take 30 seconds to complete that, we'd appreciate it. But I'd just like to give Dominique and April kind of last 30 seconds to say any kind of parting words. Like, Dominique, any final, there's one piece of takeaway you'd like people to take away from kind of what you shared, like, or if April, if there's a question that we couldn't get to, you just want to quickly respond to, I'll let you do that. But Dominique, like, what's your kind of closing message? I think Dustin just did a great wrap up on his, but which I really appreciate. Dominique, anything else you'd just like to add as a final takeaway?
Sure, thank you. So I think that major focus was on the how, which is super important. And when done right, inclusion and belonging can be leveraged as powerful engagement and retention strategies. So, but in order to achieve this, organizations must be transparent in practices, communications, and also providing safe spaces where people feel fully integrated into their work. And for that person that was wondering, how do I deal with discrimination in the workplace? There's Lisa Rice, she said, somebody feels uncomfortable with you being around, let them move. Don't let anybody take power over your journey.
Well, that's great. April, I'll give the final
Jeez.
microphone to you. Kind of quick final comments you wanted to share.
Very quickly, there was a question up above that I was trying to put Dustin on the hot seat, but someone asked that as a person of color, if you're not seen in the workplace, what do you do? And the way that I like to approach that is when you're feeling those kinds of challenges, start from a place of curiosity. So if it's an opportunity to go to your manager and say, I just wanted to share with you that, this is what I perceive that I'm experiencing. And if, is there something I need to do differently? Is there something that can be done to help me get myself out there more? Sometimes I feel I'm not seen, and I really would love to be contributing to this organization in a way that is impactful. So come at it with curiosity first. It's not going to work every time, but it's a way to create a safe space for someone to recognize that that's how you're feeling, or that's how you're being treated, and it gives them safe space to start to remedy it. Sometimes the conversation has to get a little more pointy, if I can say that. That's not the first place to start, but certainly if you have to be more direct, then again, ask what can be done to help, shift that what you're experiencing. So those can be difficult conversations, and trying to answer that question in 30 seconds is not necessarily fair, but I like to start most things with curiosity. So that's just my little tip of the day, and I think that this conversation has been really, really, I won't say helpful, but helpful for some, but really been broad and diverse in terms of the different perspectives. So thank you so much for allowing me to take part.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank both Dustin, Dominique, and April all for joining us. I think it's been very helpful and insightful. We will be sharing the recording and the slides that Fred had shared earlier with everyone who's joined. So feel free to share that within your networks that other people may benefit. It will be on our website. So again, thank you very much for participating, some very practical kind of tools and ideas. I've been taking notes, and we'll review some of those. Okay, here's some of the things that we need to kind of take away and kind of learn from. So thank you all for participating. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of the day. And again, feel free to check us out. If you don't know the work we do as a council, we'd certainly always like to participate. And if you have follow-up questions for our panelists, I think you can easily find them online, and I'm sure they'd be happy to engage you in conversation. So thank you everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.